We are we're back with our show.
So he starts.
I I'm really glad to be here, and
So
I brought some magnifying equipment because today I really want to be able to focus on the minutia of a few things that I don't think get enough attention. So I came equipped like a cyborg, ready to join with you and partner with you. And and
you ain't partnering with me. I don't know.
He has a thing against people that wear equipment. I don't know what it is, Just because we have our own special parties and social clubs doesn't mean that we don't go out in public and interact with normal people out there. But I want to focus on the minutia of things that that seem to escape the narrative of academia and history,
Right.
things that fall off of the map, and beyond which here be monsters in the world of the common narrative. Because the Indians and the Pilgrims sat down to a lunch. The French, they just suddenly rose up one day randomly and attacked the Bastille. And Stalin was a practical statesman who overhauled his country's economy. Those are the truths that we hold self-evident when we attend the Common Core public school literacy PTA efforts of public education. But
yeah,
many of us think that there's more to it. And so call us crazy, write us off as nerds who wear equipment, to
conspiracy theorists,
nerds who study too hard, whatever you want to do. But I still think that there's something there that isn't quite it. I remember myself, a colleague in college, all getting papers marked down for using outside sources and materials and referring to things that weren't in the teacher's official bibliography. Even, I think I got a book report failed one time because the book wasn't in the school library, and you could only do book reports on books that were in the school library. So it was an unapproved book.
That wasn't me marking down those papers, by the way.
No, it was the Heidelberg professors, and it was 1938. No, it wasn't, but it might as well have been. And we did slip an award or two under those professors' doors. I remember the secret student society that we created to award people whose we can't really say in English, it's too profane, but del fato trombetta, something like that, whose spots made trumpets with from the lectern. But okay, so I want to ask you, that's our warm-up today. I want to ask you, looking like the Borg that I am, about the strange fact, Dr. Farrell, of the New World being known to so much of the Old World before it was officially discovered.
Right.
So what bugs me about this is we all know the narrative is not true, that that people thought the world was flat. We know that educated people at the time of Columbus knew the world to be round. They didn't suspect it. It was obvious from observation, from empirical science to them. But we still cling to the narrative that they didn't know there was land out there, and they didn't know there was anything other than Europe and Asia and a big expanse in between. And yet there seems to be a striking amount of evidence that that is not true, or at least it's not universally true, that a lot of people knew there was land out there and that it wasn't China.
Right.
And I don't understand why this is missing from the narrative. So let's just review the facts. So number one, 6th century, Brendan the Navigator, widely understood to have landed in North America, in the North American hemisphere. Of course, we have the Norse sagas, which people used to think, oh, that's myth. It's, nobody really knows. I always like it when some sophomore goes, nobody knows anything, we don't know. And it's like, no, we actually do know. There's more evidence that the Civil War occurred than that Donald Rumsfeld has a brain. So we know that it happened, and we know it was 1861 to 1865. We know that Dr. Farrell says if you learn dates and places and things like that and names, the facts are the things they can't take away from you. They can mess with your mind and give you the interpretation, but as long as you have the facts and you know certain things happen before others and not after other things, you can sort of make sense of the world no matter what sleight of hand people pull. So I'm looking at the 6th century. I'm looking at the Norse sagas, and in the Norse sagas, we didn't believe this stuff, many people, but in 1960, we have definitive fire pit evidence showing that, in fact, in Greenland and Newfoundland, there were Norse settlements, that the Norse indeed did discover America in the 10th century. If we use the word discover to mean that they discovered it for themselves, whether they were the first people to discover it or not is another question. And the people we're talking about are Eric the Red, Leif Erikson, Thorvald Eriksson, Thorfinn the Valiant, Freydis, which is, I think, the sister of Leif Erikson. And interestingly enough, about these Norse, many of the Norse are Orthodox, which is a little known fact. Many of the Irish are Orthodox. So I can't help but notice that the 6th century discoverers are Orthodox, the 10th century discoverers are Orthodox. And so this itself makes me wonder if this is part of the reason for the suppressed narrative. But it doesn't explain to me why the narrative would be suppressed 500 years ago or 600 years ago. Why even then it would be suppressed. So my questions to you are, number one, what evidence is there that Europe knew? If the Irish knew and the Norse knew, and the Irish and the Norse, there's evidence they traded with Europe, then how could Europe not know that there was land out there that wasn't China? What evidence is there? And if there's evidence that somebody in Europe knew, or that maybe it wasn't the common man, but some educated people knew, how is it that in the 15th century, Europe apparently forgot and just sort of, oh yeah, that's right, there's land out there? How did that occur?
Well, I went into all of that in Financial Vipers of Venice, and I expanded on that in Thrice Great Hermetica in the Janus Age. There is, as you say, there's a great body of Norse evidence. So let's build on the Norse Celtic evidence and go a step further. If you look at the Archdiocese of Hamburg, circa the 12th, 13th century, that archdiocese was responsible for the Scandinavian countries and Iceland and Greenland. And as a matter of fact, there was a bishop that was appointed in I think it was the 13th or 14th century, to be the Bishop of Greenland. So in other words, that suggests to me that the papacy at least had some knowledge, due to its connections with the Norse people, and previously, of course, Brendan, the Celts, and so on, that they had some sort of knowledge about what was going on. Then let's add one more crucial bit of evidence here, and that's the Zeno map. And I talked a great deal about that in Financial Vipers of Venice, and really expanded on it in Thrice Great Hermetica. The Zeno brothers this was a manuscript that was published in Venice in the 16th century. This is an important point because many people dispute the reality of this. But the Zeno brothers were Venetian traders. They were a well-known old noble family in Venice. And they actually, according to the story that was presented in this Venetian manuscript, they journeyed to the North Islands of the British Islands, the Faroes, the Orkneys, and so on. They journeyed with one of the Sinclairs across the ocean to essentially Newfoundland, where their contact with the Native American population there in Newfoundland is recounted in great detail. And in that account, the natives tell them that, yes, we've got some of your books, and they showed them books in Latin and so on and so forth. So in other words, the contact had predated this. Now, let's look at the Zenos. And again, I'm reviewing stuff in Thrice Great Hermetica, but my purpose here is to address your second question. The Zeno family, if you go back to the Fourth Crusade that sacked Constantinople, the blind Doge of Venice, Enrico Dandolo, as you recall, diverted the crusade to Constantinople. And I personally think that it was his intention to sack Constantinople right from the outset. In other words, this was a deliberate Venetian plan. Of course, Pope Innocent III hit the roof, as we know, that, you know, how dare you go attack Christians and so on and so forth. But Dandolo did this. And after the Venetians were successful in conquering Constantinople, installing a Venetian puppet, the Podesta, the Venetian governor that was appointed to be the governor of the Byzantine Empire, was in fact a member of the Zeno family. And it's my suspicion that when they conquered Constantinople, what they gained access to, because it's after the Fourth Crusade that you see a very interesting thing happen, what they gained access to were the imperial archives. And many of those archives, in turn, I suspect, contained or included remnants of the Library of Alexandria, including maps. So it's after the Fourth Crusade that you begin to see the medieval portallands appearing, which, if you look at some of them, I include pictures of them in the book. If you look at some of these, they are astonishingly accurate maps of Europe. You compare them to Ptolemy's maps of Europe, and the disagreement is palpable. The medieval portallands were actually astonishingly accurate. So what you have between the Fourth Crusade and Columbus is you've got indications that in Europe there's some sort of underground cartographic tradition. Now, the other important thing we need to remember is that Venice is allied to the Templars, all right? And I actually think that Venice gains most of its knowledge of banking from its alliance with the Templars. So the Templars themselves, it's been strongly suspected, went over to New England. We have the famous case of the knight that's carved on a rock in Massachusetts. And this fully outfitted Western medieval knight, this is a carving dated before Columbus by a couple of centuries. So in other words, there's some sort of contact going on. The question is, why is it kept secret? And then why do we have the papacy, essentially under Innocent VIII, sponsoring in the background, sponsoring Columbus and Ferdinand and Isabella's project? I suspect, Daniel, that the main reason that we haven't been told all of this is it's a financial banking story. Because what the Templars are doing is they're accessing a hidden source of bullion, and they're bringing bullion directly from North America, as the Spanish would later do, directly from North America back to Europe. And because of their alliance with Venice, it's very interesting, after the Fourth Crusade, Venice begins its rise as the bullion capital of Western Europe. They literally control and manipulate the bullion markets to such an extent that they drive out their competition, Florence, and so on and so forth. So you have a secret supply of bullion that Venice, at least, is trying to keep quiet. It's the Venetians, in other words, I think, that you have to look to, and the Genoese, that you have to look to for suppressing all of this. When it becomes clear that the knowledge is becoming too widespread, particularly after Philip IV suppresses the Templars. When this happens, I think it's becoming clear that the knowledge to the Venetians and the Genoese, that the knowledge is getting out. So you see them doing a very interesting thing. The Venetians begin to liquidate their state debt, and so do the Genoese, and they start transferring all of this capital northward out of Venice, eventually to Amsterdam, and then eventually to England. The Genoese pursue the backing of Ferdinand and Isabella and their project with the blessing of Innocent VIII. Now, at that point, I think what we're really looking at, Daniel, is if you look at the what are called the capitulations that Columbus and Ferdinand and Isabella signed. They were essentially a contract. If you look at the stipulations in the contract, Queen Isabella, when Columbus presented his case to go to the Spice Islands and comes back and says, you know, I found a new world, Queen Isabella makes a very interesting statement. She said, "It's almost, sir, as if you knew there was something out there, you know, wink, wink, nod, nod." And I happen to believe that's the case. I think that Columbus and the other bit of evidence we need to recall here, Daniel, is that the Piri Reis map, the Turkish admiral's map in the 16th century, also indicates in the marginal notes that this Turkish admiral made that Columbus indeed had a map that he was using for the New World. In other words, the public story was completely fabricated. What you had was a journey of revelation rather than discovery, because it's very clear that Columbus himself had been to the New World prior to his first voyage of discovery. So what you had, I think, Daniel, is a project that was blessed by the banking powers of Genoa. It was blessed by the papacy. It was sponsored by Ferdinand and Isabella, simply to make the whole thing public, because by that point, the two major banking centers of Western Europe, Genoa and Italy, had successfully transferred their center of operations out of the Italian peninsula and were moving them to Western Europe to begin, you know, the so-called age of exploration. So in other words, bottom line, follow the money. It's the central bankers meme again.
Well, so this leads me to a couple of areas that I want to explore, and I unfortunately, like many of our conversations, they're non-linear. It forces me to choose a direction, rather than go down all of the tines at once. And so I'm going to do what seems like a random one and come back to some of the other ideas you expressed. So I'm going to read a passage, and I'm going to ask you some questions about the passage. To write it, he visited the Danish king Svend Estridsson, who had knowledge of the northern lands, and told him about the islands discovered by Norse sailors far out in the Atlantic, of which Vinland was the most remote. And we're talking about one of the Norse sagas here. The exact phrasing of this, the first mention of Vinland, is known in known written sources is as follows, and this is a quote. He also told me that many in this part of the ocean have discovered an island called Vinland because there are grapevines growing wild, in which produces the best of wines, from trustworthy Danes rather than from fantastic tales. I have also heard that there's an abundance of cereal which is self-sown. Beyond this island, he, King Sven of Denmark, says, are no more inhabitable islands in the ocean. Everything farther out is covered by immense masses of ice and perennial fog. Martianus tells of this. One day of sailing beyond, I think it's Thulet, Thulethe. One day of sailing beyond that sea is solid. This, the widely traversed King Harold of Norway found to be true. With his ships, he recently investigated the extent of the Northern Ocean, but finally had to turn back when the extreme limit of the world disappeared in fog before his eyes. He barely escaped the gaping ravine of the abyss. And of course, we make fun of this now. We say, all right, clearly there's a normal explanation for this. The sailors were afraid. They turned back out of cowardice. They came back with tall tales to explain what had happened. But obviously there is more to this in many cases, in your view. And so I have a couple of rather unusual questions. So you tend to ask the question, if you look at ancient texts and take them at face value, rather than just dismiss them outright, what would that tell us?
Right.
So the natural question then for this would be, could there have been a modern ice age in the 10th century, where ice really did cover enough of the Northern Ocean that you couldn't easily take a ship that wasn't an icebreaker through it to the north, to the New World, that that this is not made of. And two, could there be another interpretation other than simply dismissing it for this great ravine that is there? Could there have been a seismic or geological shift that we now dismiss as non-existent?
Sure. I think
either because some continent, some lost continent, sank into the ocean, leaving a giant pouring ravine and creating dense fog and ice, or for some other reason.
I tend to think, again, that account probably is telling us something about the climate and the then geology and geophysics of the age that we have not yet taken seriously. I think there is evidence for a mini ice age, although that mini ice age tends to be thought of by most commentators as being around the 15th and 16th centuries. But I do think that it could also be something that they were reporting on in North America. You'd have to look at Native American stories and lore. And if I remember correctly, I did talk about this in Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men to a certain extent. If I remember correctly, some of the sources that I used also mention native stories about very, very cold climates centuries prior to contact with the West. So that could be true. But the other thing I suggest here with stories like this, and this is particularly true when you look at the stories that the French fishermen, you had fishermen, French and Spanish fishermen along the Bay of Biscay, that would actually go and fish in the New World. This is another source of these stories. And they'd bring back these phenomenal catches, and the secret was that they were trying to protect was where they were fishing. I suspect, in other words, that many of these stories about monsters, about flat earth, about falling off the edge were stories that they themselves put out as spin to discourage any competition from going and looking. So I think there's definitely that factor involved. You don't see these stories appearing so much in connection with the Templars or the Venetians or the Genoese that had information like this. So I think that's the other possibility here. In other words, taking the text seriously, in my opinion, also means that you've got to account for the fact that human nature, you know, being conservative in our philosophy here, the fact that human nature doesn't really change all that much. And that one of the things that they're going to do is protect their markets and protect their interests by putting out spin and getting rid of any potential competition. I think, again, by the time you have the Fourth Crusade, that period from the Fourth Crusade up to the suppression of the Templars, by that time it's becoming so obvious to people in the know that there's something out there, that Venice and Genoa, as I say, they take the decision they're going to transfer their headquarters and move them westward towards the Atlantic so that they can have a base of operations. So they literally do this. They create proxies, quite frankly, in Spain and France, the Netherlands, and then eventually England to capitalize on the discovery of the New World. So yeah, I think you're looking at two possibilities. Reality, they're describing things that are actually the case. And secondly, they may be spinning either the reality by exaggerating it, or they may be inventing it whole cloth to discourage competition. That's my guess.
All right. So so you don't think it's likely that there was a ravine there, or a lot
No,
of
I didn't
ice,
say that.
but or rather, you think there are other explanations, such as fishermen's myths, you know, intentional misdirection, etc. That
Could be.
Are perhaps using Occam's razor are more likely or more believable, perhaps, than just that the face value, yeah, maybe there's a ravine or there was ice there. So, all right, let's take that.
Let me stop a minute. Let me
Okay,
stop.
maybe I'm misinterpreting.
No, you're not. You're not. You're not misinterpreting. I'm not dismissing the story of the ravine, because there is a bit of evidence that there were explorers, Norse explorers, and even in some cases you hear tales of discoveries in the Grand Canyon uncovering Egyptian artifacts. So in other words, I have no difficulty with these people maybe making it all the way to the Grand Canyon and describing it as a great ravine, and perhaps doing so during a period of climatic change, of a mini ice age, in which case that ravine is going to be socked in with snow. So I have no difficulty with any of that. I'm just saying that, rather than look at things in terms of simply one or the other, I think it's a mixture of both. They're reporting on truths, but they may be exaggerating them to a great extent to dissuade competition. That's all.
Fair enough. So let me spin it in a different direction. So
sure.
In 600 BC, there was, I think it's a Babylonian map that is circular, called the Imago Mundi. And that map and the accompanying text describes 7 continents. And which is interesting, because to have that knowledge, you would either have to physically go to those continents, or you would have to have some kind of surveillance. It would be global, aerial, global, whatever, whether that's interdimensional or it's physical or whatever it is, or you would have to have access to some kind of knowledge that is otherworldly, spiritual, whatever, or you would have to have a correlation in, you would have to have a hypothetical or known correlation between the information you had direct access to, physically or empirically, and other things that exist on the planet. So for instance, you'd have to be able to look up at the stars and believe that the configuration of the stars, or the configuration of masses on the moon or another visible body, corresponded in some way mathematically to masses on planet Earth. And so I have a bunch of questions about this, but my first question is, what do you think is the likelihood that there is a correspondence between celestial bodies and land masses on the Earth? Why would there be, if there is such a correspondence? Is that what the Babylonians had access to?
Holy cow. That's a whopper.
I know.
Yeah.
I brought my magnifying glass because I intended, Dr. Farrell, to flip this bad boy up and zoom in.
Yeah, what you're suggesting is that there is a lost physics that correlates celestial data and landmass accretion and placement on planet Earth.
Well, I'm not talking about ley lines or anything.
I know what you're talking.
I'm suggesting that it could be as simple as I look at the moon or I look at the constellations, and the original purposes might have had to do with mapping the Earth rather than mapping the stars. But I'm also suggesting, I'm not suggesting I believe it. I'm asking, because you've delved into this, if there's not the potential for, yes, a physics or an interdimensional or spiritual, not to necessarily draw hard and fast boundaries between those 3 things. But to suggest that there's some kind of access to information that does not require direct empirical observation, but still you could know a thing locally. All I'm saying is maybe they didn't have to go there to be able to map it.
All right. My standard take, you're asking me to connect dots I haven't previously connected, but my standard take has always been that when you're dealing with things like the Imago Mundi, with the Piri Reis map, with the medieval Portoland maps, and so on, is that you are dealing with a hidden cartographic tradition that is handed down from high antiquity. And the reason I've suggested that is going all the way back to the first pyramid book, when I point out that the Great Pyramid appears to have been positioned as at least a marker of the prime meridian in ancient times. All right. And the reason why is, if you look at it, it sits almost smack dab in the center of the world island, the Eurasian African continent. So it sits almost smack dab in the geophysical center of that landmass. And therefore, many people speculate, and I think the evidence now is overwhelming, that if you plot out all of the megalithic and ancient ruins on planet Earth, they are mapped in a precise mathematical relationship to the Great Pyramid. Now, that suggests in turn to me and to many other researchers that there was some sort of knowledge about the actual physical shape of the world that was handed down from high antiquity, from a truly global civilization that pre-existed. And we get into my cosmic war speculations and all of that. But you're asking, is there a way that they may have been able to do this with some degree of accuracy based simply on observation of the stars and physical correlation by principles of physics unknown to us of how these land masses would be placed? Now, I think that there is a possibility that that speculation is worth looking at. And the reason I think it is if you go back, you look at ancient Egyptian texts, the pyramid texts, the Edfu texts, you look at some of the material that Wallace Budge presents in his a little known book. I happen to have a copy of it, called Ancient Egyptian Amulets and Superstitions. You know, this is a guy with too much time on his hands at the British Museum. So he writes this book, and he points out that the claim for astrology that is made in Egypt echoes the claims for it made in ancient Sumer. And the claim is that these observations, astrological predictions and so on, were made and taken over the course of thousands of years of observation. So in other words, there's a physics, there's an actual observational science that we've lost to it. That may have allowed them to predict not necessarily the exact shape, but at least to predict the placement of large land masses on the surface of the planet, and therefore go looking for them. That may have been the case. Let me put it differently. Everything that I think I've seen in terms of recent kind of off-the-books thinking in physics, particularly in relationship to nuclear weapons, does suggest to me that there is a correlation between the physics of local celestial space and certain types of physical events on Earth. I think this is why nuclear yields vary over time and placement on the planet when you detonate them. So there's a physics there. And it is possible, therefore, if you posit a high civilization in antiquity with gobs of scientific knowledge that we've lost, they may have had a science like that. I'm not. I think that's an idea worth looking at. Quite frankly, I'm kind of gobsmacked by the speculation there. I think there may be something to that.
Well, as you know, I have a tendency to synthesize some of your ideas into piles while you're working on other ideas, and I learned this method when I saw your master map of all conspiracies one day, which covered multiple tables in many rooms, but and and required multiple layers as you drew connections between. I think somewhere in the middle there was somebody called the Rothschilds, but not far from there was all kinds. There was prehistoric cave dwellers and all kinds of other things. Metal smiths and and hospitalers, but as I do this kind of analysis, I can't help but remember when we discussed. I have multiple questions about it. You could probably gather that I have multiple things I want to tackle at once.
Sure.
It's really like a giant diagram, but we talked about non-local phenomena, non-local physics, and we know that experiment where the birds are raised in an isolated environment. Separated from, they cannot fly without dropping dead. They will run out of energy. They cannot fly off the island, and yet birds raised off the island that cannot meet them, the knowledge is passed down within one generation to the birds on the island without any contact. So if I hold that point in my head, and then I add to it another point that not only birds, but dolphins, whales, and other creatures seem to be able to circumnavigate the globe without either a map or an aerial view in the case of the sea creatures, or any other instrument that would fit in a library. Seem to be able to navigate the features of the planet as though they know where everything is. So I'm holding that thought. The third thought I'm having comes from Gardner's studies of intelligence, which I actually was working on when I was studying educational theory when you were my instructor. So when I would leave your classes, I go study educational theory, and the big debate at that time, if everybody remembers, the bell curve had come out, and the debate was whether raw G-score could be a measure of intelligence anymore, the standard IQ test, whether it worked. And so the politically correct book that everybody's passing around, I still think it's a valid book. I also think the bell curve is an interesting book with valid claims about raw G-score, and so does everybody else that studies that in the field. They find valid claims in it. The Gardner's assertion is that there are something like 11 kinds of intelligence, and that doesn't dismiss the idea of raw G-score, but the examples as a measure of intelligence, but a certain kind of intelligence. And he explores these other types of intelligence. And one that he cites is the intelligence of a Magic Johnson. And it's a type, it has a name. It's a particular kind of intelligence called spatial intelligence, which means that Magic Johnson can be facing the opposite way and moving, and everything around him moving. So there are distractions. His brain's managing a lot of different things. He's multitasking, almost like holding a bunch of constellations that are moving while you're holding them in your mind. And yet at all times, he knows where the ball is, even when he can't see it. He knows where the ball is in relation to himself, in relation to other players, in relation to the court, in relation to the hoop. He knows, right? And he's able to turn around and take that thing or run with the thing or do the next action that places him somewhere, almost like if you could play blindfolded chess, right? And not even by feel, you could just do it with your mind. And so that ability exists in human beings. So as I think of all this, what makes me curious is the possibility of a correlation between sort of electromagnetic energy and the actual physical land masses of things. We know that if you placed objects around a room, they change the airflow of the room, they change the acoustics of the room, they change the electromagnetic properties of the room. You made this argument in the Giza Death Star, obviously, something very similar. This is not disputed science. This is basic science. We know all of this. So why wouldn't it be true on a global scale? And if it were true on a global scale, all you would need is a sophisticated enough instrument to measure it. What if that statement, if we just took the word sophisticated and flipped it and said all you need is a simple enough instrument? What if everybody has in them, every living creature, or at least birds and fish and human beings, mammals, have an instrument built in that allows you to essentially circumnavigate the physical space in relation to other things, like Magic Johnson? And like Gardner's claim, some people have it more than others. Like Magic Johnson, I can't manage all of that stuff in a physical environment. I can do it intellectually. I can't do it. And maybe Magic Johnson, not anything about him, his color, or anything like that, but maybe he can't do it personally.
Right.
But I can't do what he can do to the same degree. But in the right environment, I've studied martial arts. I've done some pretty amazing things physically in my life. I've prevented car crashes and shocking situations. I've done all kinds of little physical things. We all have it to some degree. We all can be a little bit spectacular. So I have multiple other questions, Dr. Farrell, but I'm wondering if we don't have a cartographic system of all physical things from room size to continental size built into the living creature.
I think so. You know, I play pipe organ, so I know what you're talking about in terms of multitasking spaces, because, you know, organists can't watch everything that they're doing. So they have to rely on what physiologists call the kinesthetic sense of where this body limb or this body part is in relationship, you know, to the console. But let's go deeper than that. You mentioned the birds on the islands, and Rupert Sheldrake, the famous British biologist, has been doing work for a number of years in what he calls the morphogenetic field, because basically he's saying that there's some element of consciousness, however small it may be in the terms of animals or what have you, that know that there's some sort of non-local information transfer. And I agree with you. I think humans have this. And more importantly, it's tuned into the environment if we're able to clear out all the noise. And let me give an example of what the environment in this case I think means. If you look at a map of the northern Pacific from the Kamchatka Peninsula in eastern Siberia on down through the Japanese archipelago down into the northern part of the South China Sea, you'll see a string of islands, and there's 3 loops, and they form these perfect arcing semicircles, all right, if you look at it. And what that suggests to me and to others, my friend Walter Bosley has a friend by the name of Sesh Hari that wrote an interesting book called Handprint of Atlas. It's full of a lot of personal stuff, but the basic bottom line is that this guy looks at geological features on the map and sees evidence of gravity waves, of large-scale standing waves in the earth, creating things like that series of 3 perfectly formed arcs of island archipelagos in the northern Pacific. And I think that this, in turn, affects the physiology of living creatures. In other words, they sense this. There's a deep sense of it. Let me add one more physiological feature here. If you look at biophysics, biophysicists are actually talking about the idea that the thing that holds the body together, that makes an organism work, is precisely the phenomenon of non-locality coupled with quantum tunneling. In other words, what happens to an individual cell in one part of the body instantaneously transmits information to the whole rest of the body by some non-local information transference mean. So I think, yes, if you go back and look at the ancients, if you posit that they may have had some sort of extremely high science, they may have been tuned into this somehow and able to make accurate predictions in terms of land masses of the earth. So in other words, I think there's a, to try and tie together what you're speculating about here, which I think is very, very interesting, intriguing. If you tie things together, what you're looking at is Sheldrake's morphogenetic field, or I prefer to call it an information construct in the field, in the medium. It's a purely higher dimensional mathematical construct, if you will. You're looking at that. You're secondly looking at physiological responses and connectivity to that in any living organism, and that allows that transference of information from an isolated species on one island to the same species with which it can have no physical contact on another island. That's the mechanism that's working here. The third thing is, I think you're looking at, to coin the term, you're looking at a kind of psychophysics. You're looking at a physics of consciousness that we're just barely, I think, beginning to uncover. There's an increasing spate of writings in physics. There's an increasing interest of scientific exploration of the effects of consciousness, particularly group multiplier effects on physical materials. And this has been documented to occur. I have in the members area a webinar on the work of William Tiller. So yeah, I think we're looking at that possibility here, Daniel, that all of these things were connected, that somebody in ancient times knew a great deal more about this sort of thing than we do now. In addition, I strongly suspect, Daniel, that we're looking at an underground and very secret tradition of people that have preserved at least fragments of that down to our day. And it's increasingly coming out into the open. I think that's an excellent speculation that you have.
Well, I want to maybe go a little farther with it. And so you know that in the 1940s, the Soviets and DARPA conducted a wide range of psychological and parapsychological experiments.
Yes.
And what I find interesting about those, there's an article in Scientific American, which in today's show notes I'll share with your viewers. But there's an article in Scientific American that sort of showed an information tree of how the Soviets thought about these processes in relation to other processes and how they compartmentalized their research. And they describe their own research as impressionistic, but if you look at the chart they're talking about, it's basically a flow chart of a hierarchical chart. It starts at the top with information processes. And I find that particularly interesting because the 1940s were essentially the beginning of the computer era as we know it.
Right.
The beginning of the era of data processing and information theory. Right. It may have reached the consumer market 40 years later, but it was definitely in the military applications market, you know, at the end of the Cold War or at the end of World War II. So, and arguably, and this is wild ass speculation, but your readers have a high tolerance for that. Arguably, one could say that it is information technology and information theory that started and preserved the Cold War. It is a Cold War over not just information, but the way in which we order and think about properties of reality. And you know, computer science is my background as well, and I've spent a lot of time in that. And so I look at this stuff with that eye, and the way the Soviets organized it, they had information processes, and followed immediately after information processes came something they dubbed biological communication. Yes. Biological communication is a very natural sounding term. It almost sounds like this is something endemic to the human being. It's normal, it's there. They're dismissing the distinction between that which is supernatural and that which is natural. They're not using that distinction, which is very notable given the Orthodox tradition of Russia and the way in which they did not use the dialectic in the West that gave us that natural supernatural distinction in the Roman Latin Church. So they may be Soviets, but they still came from this Russian culture, which had as its bedrock this denial of some of these dialectics. And so they go right from information process to biological communication, which is we would call it remote viewing. Right. And anybody's seen that film Hearts at Atlantis, which is enormously a piece of amazing cinema, knows what we're talking about with remote viewing. And they associate remote viewing and biological communication, they consider it a precognitive ability. Yes. So they're saying that there's this ability that's latent to the human species that it is pre-rational. And I couldn't help but think about this and think, first I started thinking, how does this relate to the current thing you're exploring with electroceuticals.
Right.
But two, what if you reinterpret the last 40 years? What if you reinterpret the last 40 years, the Cold War, as being synonymous and being a template that overlays perfectly with the quest to define an information science that is partly technological and based on computer science, but it's also partly paranormal,
Right.
and also simultaneously biological. What if this Cold War is a war for how we define, communicate, and document the way in which human beings access information? And what if part of what's being protected is access to methods and results from those experiments that we're recovering from a much older hermetic knowledge?
Oh,
Uh,
wow.
so that is me stringing together some admittedly diverse things that you've come up with, but I can't help but notice those possibilities.
Oh, wow. Yeah, doff my hat moment there. Yeah, I absolutely think you're onto something there too. The idea that the Cold War is uh, partially a war for information consciousness science, if you will. The thing that convinces me, Daniel, that you're onto something, I don't know if you've ever run across or read any of the works of a U.S. Army retired lieutenant colonel by the name of Tom Bearden. But he wrote for many years concerning the Soviet experiments in what he was calling scalar physics or quantum potential physics. Sometimes he uses that term. And a great deal of what he points out is that the Soviets were making gigantic strides in the relationship of consciousness, biophysics, and what we would call just plain ordinary physics in the West. And they were doing so, and I think you're correct here. They were doing so because the Russian mentality doesn't have this nice, neat Cartesian dualism between, the preternatural, the supernatural, and the natural. They don't think that way. So they're able to make connections and explore things that philosophically it's much more difficult for the West to do. So I do think that this Cold War idea you have is fundamental here. There's another thing that also enters into this, and that's we've discussed this in the vid chats recently on a couple of occasions. There was a German computer scientist during the Second World War, pardon me, by the name of Konrad Zuse, Zuse. He was the German that built that enormous computer that was used by the Deutsche Reichspost during the Second World War, probably in connection with their atomic bomb program. It was a gigantic computer. But the thing that makes Zuse's information processing theory interesting is that, first of all, he doesn't pursue computer languages along the digital line. He doesn't pursue the von Neumann, ones and zeros approach to information processing. So in other words, he's programming his computers, for want of a better expression, in an almost analog way. And if you look at the computers he actually designed and came up with, they're kind of partly digital and they're kind of partly analog. It looks to me like there's some sort of development of the analog computers that were put on warships, to lob shells at the enemy. They look to me to be that sort of thing. They're partly digital and they're partly analog. So you have this idea, if you get right down to it, what's going on in the Soviet Union, what's going on in Nazi Germany, is the idea that information processing is not simply a digital either-or sort of network. It's a much more complex network. I think what's happening, I'm so, to be honest with you, Daniel, I'm so taken and stunned with this idea that the Cold War is an information processing war, that I'm talking and my brain is off over here doing something completely different. Because
my goal is to give you new things to think about.
Yeah, well, that yeah, you certainly did. You certainly did, but
I'm not done.
I know you're
we
not
got a
done.
long way
I
to
know
go,
you're
baby.
not done, but
what you need to do is just take a hot bath to relax, because this is going to be one hell of a ride.
Yeah. Well, I'm planning on the bath, believe me. But the interesting thing about Zuz's approach, and you look at quantum computing now, what intrigues me about quantum computing is the basic idea is to use the quantum states of particles themselves as the encoding of information. So in other words, rather than a digital set of ones and zeros, a binary system, you're actually now dealing with each node of a central processor being able not to come up with an either or gate or an and gate. You're dealing with 7 quantum states of the electron rather than 2 at each node of information. So the possibilities for neural net mapping and connectivity, IBM, I just did a blog about this, came up with an artificial neuron in which it does all of this multi-connected, non-binary sort of networking. And this is going to raise the prospect then of how are we going to approach consciousness itself? Will these machines transduce or gate some sort of consciousness into them? I think that's a possibility we have to be concerned about. But yeah, I think, let me put it this way, Daniel. Since you raised the possibility of a Cold War over information processing technology and techniques. In other words, we've got the hardware, the hard approach, we've got the software, the soft approach.
A war over the cognitive framework used to approach these. Yeah.
Yes, I think there's a great deal to be said about that, because I'm with Catherine Austin Fitts here. I look at what's going on in Western culture and society, particularly in this country, and it's as if people are in complete meltdown in terms of rationality, common sense, and so on and so forth. We've got 2 presidential candidates that are just mystifyingly bad in terms of what they're presenting. The cognitive war here now, I think, has transitioned from Cold War to the fact that there are certain corporations, DARPA, like you said before, certain societies that are actually in possession of some of this, and they're secretly studying it. The problem is, I think the Russians remain much more sophisticated in their understanding of these things than the West does. I think they have some very sophisticated psychotronic technology in Russia that they might be willing to use if the circumstances were right. And I think we're fast approaching the circumstances. I love this idea, a cognitive Cold War. I think you're on to something profound there.
Keep in mind that part of why I'm saying this is that the Russians have a number of cognitive tools that we don't have. And you've argued, since I've known you, that the West was always on a quest to acquire these tools. So you talk about the Crusade and the attempt to get the Maslenitsa, the attempt to get the napkin of Christ, when in fact in the Russian mind it's not the original that matters, it's the copies. But there's this attempt to acquire the occult artifact of the original. And so there's a cognitive, it's not a religious, it's a cognitive distinction there.
Yes.
And so the Russians have the cognitive advantage of they are not burdened with this this dialectical thinking, this Cartesian thinking. Two, they are not, they don't automatically dismiss the supernatural, the preternatural, the occult outright. They consider things. They don't dismiss conspiracy theories outright. They're more old school. They were there when they were there when Ivan the Terrible invented some of this crap. So they're. I once told somebody something I find really effective is I believe in conspiracy theories for one reason. I've launched many of them.
Yes, exactly.
I've created a number of conspiracies and carried them out. So, so the Russians are very aware of this stuff. So they have these cognitive tools, and Billington has written extensively about the fact that we don't possess them. We have a hard time grasping them. That's why we can't make sense of the Russians. We don't have their cognitive apparatus. So I want to show a screenshot to our audience of what I'm really talking about, because I have this ability. So this is from an article by in Scientific American. And so you can see that here on the left, you have study of information processes followed by biological communication. And then what I find interesting over here under methods of investigation is you have these detectors, and they have plants, insects, and liquid crystals, and they all have them on the same parallel. And what I find interesting, I mean, there's so many things I find interesting about that analysis that I mean, I could spend all day on that, but I have some things to throw at you. I'm far from done, and I guess the only thing I know how to do right now is just bring out the Gatling gun, and throw about 6 or 8 of them at you. They're all over the map, and see what you want to deal with. But it occurred to me that if what we're hypothesizing is true, or that there's some truth to it, that weather modification might be an attempt to experiment with cartographical information sources that are non-linear and not available just by observation of the human eye, that weather modification would give us a means to interact with the energies that beings would use to navigate this, if you will, the layout of the world room. And instead of using terms like the world grid and using the ley lines, I find it helpful. There's an old analogy, the blind man in the dark room looking for the black cat that isn't there. So I'm thinking of it more as it's just a room, and there's things in the room. There's a beanbag over here and a chair over there. The world is just this room, and we're navigating it. If you flatten it out for a minute, we're navigating it, trying to figure out where things are in relation to one another without being able to see them. We've got a blindfold on. Everybody's pinned the tail on the donkey and been in and you've had to find the donkey. You've had to find the donkey, or played the pinata game where you've had to bust the pinata. So weather modification occurred to me. Secondly, it occurred to me that one of the objectives might be to create a navigational system for UFOs. And I don't mean UFOs like randomly the way people do. I mean any flight-driven or undersea-driven object that needs a non-standard navigational system that doesn't depend on simply radar, sonar, and pre-programmed mapping. But it has the ability even to adjust in wartime situations to a changing geological landscape. Because if you had parts of mountains falling off, and you had other things, and you needed to navigate tight, ultra-rapid turns as the geographic landscape is changing, a pre-programmed map, or perhaps even satellite feedback wouldn't be enough. So I thought about that. I thought about all the speculation about UFO navigational techniques, because to me that's the most fascinating thing. It's not where do they come from, it's how do they move in such seemingly random directions so quickly. No regular spacecraft can change direction as fast as the black technology that we're seeing glimpses of. That must have access to some other reliable navigational system, so that you didn't just crash into the side of a mountain all the time. And why might somebody want to develop this? Well, if you wanted to develop this and you could amp it up and program it into a computer, the purpose of a computer, and again, I learned computer science during the Cold War. My father was a rocket scientist. He actually would be sent over during the loosening of things under Gorbachev to teach the Russians and to work with their engineering teams. So I place information science squarely in a Cold War context. I would, I know that computers are designed to do one thing, the things that a human would do if he could do it faster.
Right.
It's not really about more accuracy. It's about the ability to do repetitive things much more quickly. So if
Right.
you needed to fly more quickly than a human being could react, and you needed to draw on senses that were latent in a human being, and you need to draw on that information more quickly than a human being could draw on more accurately,
Oh,
what you
wow.
would do
Yes.
is you would
Mhm.
find the information source that was latent in nature for the purpose of adapting it for use in programmed technology.
Right.
And that made me think of robotic drones. That, you know, the end goal for creating something with UFO-like navigation technology wouldn't necessarily be to have all these manned spacecraft around. We always think, oh yeah, it's so that we can fly around in space. Well, if we have that now, we can already fly around in space. That's not the issue. And you don't really need to navigate in space that quickly. It's not like, oh wow, I almost hit a star, right? It's not the Millennium Falcon. What you would need it for is you would need it for drone technology. You would need to have
Right.
drones that could move at the rate of these manned craft. And so that led me to one final area of query, and then I'll shut up and let you kind of unpack this if you want, which is, what if the goal were either interdimensional travel or interdimensional surveillance, either wormhole navigation or remote viewing beyond normal celestial boundaries? See, that would tie everything together, that the purpose wouldn't, it's not every day you're going to have a nuclear war and be blowing up mountains. And the purpose, and these drones, standard technology is enough. It's not like a bunch of Iraqi soldiers on the ground are going to compete with us in the robotic drone category, right? They can't keep up with that. So why would we need technology like this? And for that, I went back to that chart and the Russians. Well, what if we could use it? What if we could use this technology and program it into a computer that could really amp up the natural ability present in a dolphin or a human being, and use that to predictively map bodies we can't see that are either on the other side of a wormhole, too distant in a stellar environment,
Right.
or beyond the normal bounds of physics, such that we would call them interdimensional? That would strike me as the ultimate use for such a technology.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, boy.
Surveillance or travel mapping.
Ding, ding, ding. Doff my hat again. All right. I was intrigued with that diagram for one very good reason. At the very top, the term that was used was psychoenergetics. All right. That's exactly the term that the Soviet scientists did use for all of this very secret inquiry in the Soviet Union. And it's also the term that you encounter heavily if you read the physics works of Colonel Bearden. All right. He also talks about gravitobiology in this connection, and that's the name of one of his books. If you haven't read it, it's worth reading, because it goes in depth into the Soviet exploration of these areas. Now, you're suggesting two possibilities that they'd use this for: navigation and surveillance. So let's look back at my map of the Northern Pacific with those three concentric, perfectly semicircular circles of island archipelagos. Those are signatures of, in my opinion, of gravity waves. And what would a gravity wave be? Well, in our vid chats, I talk constantly about the difference between a Hertz wave and a longitudinal wave. All right. A Hertz wave is a typical sine wave. It's what we tend to think of when we think of electromagnetic energy. So if you look at a Hertz wave, if you take a jump rope and suspend it between two people and jerk the rope up and down, you're going to get a typical sine wave. And that wave is going to transmit very little amount of energy to the person holding the other end of the rope, because most of the energy is lost in the up-down motion of the Hertz wave. All right. A longitudinal wave would be like suspending a yardstick between two people and pressing it. The energy is all instantaneously passed through the medium of the yardstick to the other person. That's a longitudinal wave. It's literally a wave of compression and rarefaction. All right. Now, imagine that wave in the physical medium of space-time itself. In other words, a longitudinal wave is an area of compression and rarefaction in the lattice work, if you will, thinking of space like a crystal here, and we're going to get back to your diagram. Thinking of space as a crystal lattice work, which incidentally is a very, very old esoteric view. It's a wave that therefore would contract and rarefy the compression of that lattice. So in other words, a gravity wave would be a perfect way to detect, if you could figure out how they worked, it would be a perfect way to detect what you're talking about. It would detect things on the other side, so to speak, of a wormhole. It would detect masses. It would detect at great distance a nuclear explosion, because a nuclear explosion is also, for a brief moment, compressing and then releasing and rarefying the actual medium itself, all right, at the very center of the nuclear explosion. So it's going to send out, in addition to enormous amounts of Hertz waves, it's going to send out a longitudinal pulse all over the place. So you could have literally somebody on a distant star system picking up a nuclear explosion light years away if they had sensitive enough gravitational wave detection equipment to do so. So let's go back to the idea of surveillance. You could use that type of wave form to detect and follow the distant doings of other civilizations. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this, Daniel, is if you go back to the 1950s to the American physicist Thomas Townsend Brown, he proposed a paper called Project Winter Haven. You can look this up online. You can actually read what he proposed. And one of the things that he proposed to the US government was that you could create these types of longitudinal waves in the medium and detect distant nuclear explosions. You could use them for instantaneous, if you will, kind of hyperdimensional communication. And all of that, after he made the proposal, went deeply black in the United States. I mean, he dropped right off the radar screen. He was scooped up by Lockheed Martin, and so on and so forth. So could you use this for surveillance? Yes. So how would you detect this stuff? Well, if you go back to your diagram, it lists 3 detectors: plants, animals, and liquid crystals. All right. Now, I've said many times in VidChat that crystals are natural detectors of the local lattice configuration of local space. The reason why is if you grow them out of the gravitational well of the Earth, they will grow differently in response to the lack of gravity. You will not see in crystals like that typical crystal lattice displacement defects, screw defects, Schottky displacement defects, and so on and so forth. So crystals naturally respond to the gravitational environment in which they're grown. They are, so to speak, they're the signatures of what's happening in local space. Now, why is that significant? Because plants and animals' DNA is an aperiodic liquid crystal. So if you have a plant or an animal in a certain environment, it is going to respond to that environment by dint of its crystalline structure. That's what the Soviets are getting at there. Now, could all of that be used for surveillance purposes? Certainly, if you press the science far enough, if you were able to do this. And on top of all of this, the other thing that we need to throw in here is the remote viewing experiments of Puthoff and Ingo Swann at SRI. Puthoff wrote a paper called The Remote Sensing of Objects at Distance. And in the paper, he demonstrated that humans have this extraordinary ability to sense physical objects literally across the universe. And that's a non-local phenomenon. So in other words, what I'm suggesting here is you are absolutely dead on right when you're suggesting that this could be used as navigation. If you had a means to detect longitudinal waves, that in turn could lead you to detect objects hyperdimensionally through wormholes, if you will, as you put it. It would be a perfect tool of surveillance because it would give you near instantaneous responses of things to the environment. So let's look at your weather warfare, your geoengineering thing. I've always taken the view that weather warfare, geoengineering, is in part to increase the electrical conductivity of the Earth's atmosphere. And that means that any electrical phenomenon using that medium as its electrical cavity will be amplified. And that includes any environmental effect on plants, animals, humans especially, and particularly brain waves. So in other words, in addition to that, I think this is also a consciousness engineering technology that they're playing around with. And again, the West, you look at the way the West is doing it, and it's the ham-fisted hammer, pardon me, hammer approach. The Soviet research was much more subtle and much more sophisticated. Again, I think you're dead on in all of your speculations here in all three areas.
Well, I'll keep going then.
Be my guest.
So, I can't help but kind of seal part of this with another point, which is that the coming warp engine, we've talked about this in previous shows, right. And all the other technology that's being developed so that we can become an interstellar civilization. I can't help but point out a key fact, that space differs from the Earth in a fundamental way. The Earth is an island, and mapping an island. I live in New York City. Mapping Manhattan isn't that hard. You can walk it. You can walk all the way around it in a day.
Right.
So with a pencil and a pad of paper, and you can map the thing. It's an island, right? If you said, I want you to map the known world, I'm going to run out of time, and I'm probably going to make mistakes, and it's going to change by the time I get back.
Right.
So mapping an island is one thing, but with the coming warp engine, the navigational and cartographic needs of an interstellar civilization simply cannot depend upon observational mapping. You can neither go everywhere and draw it, nor can you simply get a big telescope and look at everything and draw it. You're going to need access to a source of information that can give you a cartography that maps things that mere observational techniques cannot give you.
Right.
And so if you look at that and just say water is a requirement for human life, and one requirement for space travel is the ability to map the unseeable by some means, then a warp engine is useless without a cartographic method that is so sophisticated that it would astound somebody like Columbus.
Right. Well, let me add.
I just want to throw in there that a little fact, which is that space ecologist Molly K. McCauley was murdered recently.
Yeah.
Just throwing that out there.
I blogged about that. I blogged about that because her whole specialty was precisely satellites, the economies of satellites, Earth mapping, resource mapping, and so on and so forth, which currently, at least by what we know of the public available technology, is through radar tomography and spectrography and so on and so forth. But you're saying that there's a gravitational signature, howsoever subtle, to each and every thing, like plants, animals, liquid crystals, and so on. And that's what I'm saying. There is a gravitational signature of these things, and they they rely on that as their fundamental response to their environment, not Hertzian electromagnetic waves. So in other words, We're going back to the idea I first presented in the Giza Death Star. You're talking about electroacoustical waves. You're talking about longitudinal electrical waves, all right? Now, the warp drive idea is interesting to me because if you have a warp drive, what you're essentially doing is you're taking that lattice structure, think of space again as a lattice structure, and it's going to have concentrations of lattice work depending on planetary positions, gravity in other words, which means that it's in a constant dynamical flux. Space, you can't map space as a stationary thing over a prolonged period of time because it's constantly changing. So your cartography has to take that into consideration. So how would you do it? How would you map things? Well, you'd have to map them by concentrations or rarefactions of that local lattice work. And how would you do that? Well, a warp drive essentially already is doing that. It's contracting and rarefying the lattice work of local space. It's rarefying the lattice work in front of the warp drive, and it's compacting it behind the warp drive so that you're literally being propelled not by a force but by a geometry in local space. And it's like creating a low pressure zone above an airplane's wing. You're literally being sucked up in an airplane because of that low pressure. Well, the same thing is happening with a warp drive. You're being sucked into an empty place and pushed by the concentration behind you. So that technology in itself would also mean and imply that you have the ability to pick up on naturally occurring rarefactions and compressions in a local spatial lattice work. Just as crystals, as I've said before, crystals pick up on this naturally. They grow in response to what's happening in terms of the gravitational environment that they're in. So yes, it's very, very subtle. Back in, I think it was the Secrets of the Unified Field, I pointed out something about Einstein's general theory of relativity that most people miss. In order to make general relativity work, Einstein had to assume that the geometry of a mass, of a planet or a star, was uniform, and that the space warp that it creates around it is a result of that uniformity. But as we know, he's making an assumption there for the sake of the theory, because in point of fact, gravitational acceleration on the surface of the planet Earth is not uniform or equally distributed on the surface. It's concentrated here, there's a little less of it there, all right? So in other words, there are subtle variations in a local gravitational field that Einstein doesn't even take into account in his theory. And what the Soviet scientists did, this is key, what the Soviet scientists were doing with their psychoenergetics is saying, no, these local variations are significant. They are not to be discounted. There's a science that we can be, a science and technology that we can develop on the basis of these minute variations locally. So in other words, the Soviets, Daniel, look to me like what they did is they threw out a dogma of modern Western physics, threw it right out, namely general relativity, and said we're going to pursue this area because we know the Western scientists aren't. And they came up with absolutely astonishing things, phase conjugation, in other words, time reversed waves, and so on and so forth. This whole field is so huge. I'm so glad that you've pointed it out, because again, it goes back to the cognitive war. Because what the only thing they did, Daniel, was they made a change in the presupposition and the philosophy by which they're doing all of this. That was their initial step, and it led them to astonishing accomplishments. We've just seen a little bit of their prowess in the field. They've turned off recently the computer electronics and the radar system and our most sophisticated missile frigates. They've just shut them down. They've turned off NATO communications over Syria, just blanked them out. And, we have not a clue as to what they're doing or how they're doing it. And I think it's all coming out of this psychoenergetics research. Absolutely. And it's cognitive in nature.
Well, I couldn't help but think of the possible correlation with HARP. And so have two different directions I still want to take this. And, I've debated for the last few minutes which way I'm going to go first. So I think I'll go this way first. I'm going to hit you with three possible ideas and piggyback off of something you said earlier, which is the notion of a hidden tradition of cartography. Because I had written in my notes this before the show started, I couldn't help but notice that there seemed to be some superficial similarities between the tradition of cartography and the tradition of Freemasonry in a prima facie way. They both deal with they all deal with symbols. They all deal with geometrics. They all deal with a suggestion that there's a correlation between physical space and something beyond physical space. And so I couldn't help but wonder if there was an occult tradition of cartography. And when I got to researching where cartography came from, that it originates, the oldest known stuff is on cave walls. We have maps of nearby fairly local features. At least using our current interpretive lens, we don't regard some of the other things we've seen on cave walls as global. We assume they're local. So right there's a cognitive interpretation, just like there is with texts that may or may not be accurate.
Right.
But again, if you just go back to the Babylonians and the ancient Greeks, weren't these the people that gave us essentially Freemasonry or the hermetic tools of Freemasonry? So and astrology. So I can't help but wonder, number one, so there's three parts of this. Number one is there a relationship between cartography and Freemasonry in terms of it being a superficial system for obtaining non-superficial knowledge? Number two, I can't help but notice that there are several elements to cartography and to thinking about mapping. One is the actual location of physical features on the earth, but we can't forget that we are physical features. Human beings are physical features. And so that would mean that if you were in an occult manner concerned about the placement of physical objects, one of the things I find astounding is people are like, well, this mountain is here and this pyramid is here and this ravine is here and that matters. And I'm thinking, okay, but isn't 16 million people congregated in one spot? Isn't that a physical feature just by definition, that there are all these physical things there occupying space? I mean, 6 tons of rock and 6 tons of human being fill the same amount of space, right? So that got me interested in the ritual movements of people, or just that's a term that I invented. I don't know that it exists anywhere. But I begin to think that I wonder if people like Hitler weren't involved in trying to manipulate something cartographic / esoteric. Yes. by the mass movement of people, both dispossession and exile and migratory, and also having to do with their destruction, the removal of people, because that removes something physical from the physical space, and maybe the ethnic thing was something of a cover for it. So that's a wild-ass speculation, but you still, it is not wild-ass to say that a truckload of people and a truckload of dirt are still take up a truckload, right? And the third thing that sort of that I thought about is that we currently are undergoing what some people call an immigration crisis, some people call it a refugee crisis, but we are currently seeing the mass movement of peoples throughout the earth, right, now more than ever, through warfare all throughout Africa to and the Middle East, people being displaced, the diasporas. We see almost, if somebody diabolical were behind the scenes saying, how can I treat people like items on a risk board and get a bunch of them over here and a bunch of them over there and just move them around so that I could create masses where I wanted. If you looked at people that way, if you did, I'm not saying you do, but if or somebody does, but if they did, then engineering the displacement of people through war, drought, poverty, weather manipulation, genocide, political movements that cause migration or that restrict migration would all be almost a hidden language at work, trying to manipulate physical space and cause mass to accumulate in one area and deplete in another area. So this all sounds ridiculous to me, but I put it all together and said, look, if I just thought this was a mass of Tinker Toys and I walked into a room and 1 minute they were all laid out neatly, and then the next minute there were piles of them in different areas of the room, and then I came back an hour later and more of the piles were on the left side of the room, I would think somebody was moving these things around and that they must have some purpose.
Right. No, it's not silly. Because if you look at human beings, yes, we're physical creatures, but we are also conscious creatures. So in other words, there's a metaphysical, spiritual, supernatural aspect to human beings. So if you deliberately move a mass of people with a certain type of consciousness from one environment to another, or from one context to another, we're back to my analogical calculus topological metaphor of the medium idea. If you move a certain group of people with a particular consciousness from one context or region into another that's very foreign to them, then you're going to get disruptions in, so to speak, the consciousness space of the region you're moving them into. This is what we see happening. And that is, in turn, deeply related to the practice of geomancy, where you have in esoteric lore the idea that certain spots are, sacred groves, sacred rivers, so on and so forth. Now, did Hitler actually use that science? Well, as a matter of fact, I point that out in one of my books, I forget which one, that the placement of Hitler's headquarters during World War II, particularly the big one in Rostenburg in East Prussia, was deliberately placed on certain so-called ley lines or grid nodal points on the planet in Europe. This was very deliberately done. The big Nazi party rallies at the Ludwig Stadium in Nuremberg, those big rallies, as you know, moved massive amounts of people around in these very orchestrated, choreographed ways. And I strongly suspect that what they were doing was precisely what you're suggesting. They were engineering a ritual movement of people for a purpose. The sacrifices, the Holocaust, and I would aver also abortion in this country. I've strongly suspected that many of these places are placed on ritual points for precisely that purpose. Now, let's go to Freemasons for a moment. You suggested that they might have a hidden cartographic tradition in Freemasonry. I think that's absolutely true for a very simple reason.
Well, just to clarify, not a hidden cartographic tradition in Freemasonry, but I'm wondering if there's not a parallel tradition. Freemasonry was originally the idea of stonework and the building of structures and sort of architecture. And what I'm wondering is another natural architecture is its own thing. So I'm wondering if there's not a parallel tradition that leads to a separate occult from Freemasonry rather than something within Freemasonry. Does that make sense?
Well, yeah. Both are true. I think that there is a hidden cartographic tradition in Freemasonry simply because of its tie to the Templars. And again, you've got every indication that the Templars had possession of some sort of secret cartographic tradition, be it via their alliance with Venice or that they came up with this on their own, who knows? I suspect probably a bit of both. But in terms of what you're talking about, the ritual movement of people, in Freemasonry, in the higher degree rites, particularly in the Scottish rite, they have what is called the ashlar. And the ashlar is an unfinished stone, which is then faced and dressed by masonry, all right? So you have a finished ashlar. But when you read, particularly Albert Pike's commentaries in Morals and Dogma, what he says is that the ashlar represents humanity. And masonry has the goal to finish and dress the stone. In other words, to politically order humanity to be fit into its lovely pyramidal structure. So there is the idea of a ritual movement and finishing of humanity in Freemasonry that's very much a part of it. So let's go back to your speculations about the Cold War being a war of over cognitive information and processes, and tie it in with this ancient idea that there may have been a high science behind this long ago. Back in 2015 at the Secret Space Program conference in Texas, I talked about what I called the cosmic Versailles, all right? The idea that you find traces in ancient texts that there's some sort of treaty system imposed on planet Earth. C.S. Lewis writes about this idea in Out of the Silent Planet. And when you look at the idea, it's very interesting the way that celestial space is defined cartographically, because the quarantine zone around the Earth is defined as the orbit of the moon, or in some cases the outermost orbit of the outermost planet. So in other words, what they're doing is they are picking boundaries in celestial space that are defined precisely as you've suggested, by gravity, by gravitational defined boundaries, the celestial mechanics of orbits, and so on and so forth. So in other words, there is a cartography there, and it's a cartography that is taking into account the fact that everything in space changes constantly. So the way you define things geographically, so to speak, is by those gravitational mechanics in space. And I find that very intriguing. It fits with your idea that all of this is somehow definitely there. It's definitely a part of somebody's thinking somewhere, and certainly was a part of somebody's thinking way back when. Why do we have the constant reference in the Bible, in the Quran, in esoteric literature to, you know, the first, second, third, fourth, all the way on up to the seventh heaven? Well, if you stop and think about it, those are astronomical divisions. The seventh heaven is the seventh known planet, and so on and so forth. Under the earth has an astronomical reference of its own. It doesn't mean under your feet. It literally means under the plane of the ecliptic. So in other words, if you read these texts with an astronomical eye, they're telling you, yeah, we've got a cartography here. We've got a way of looking at things that doesn't require, as you said, us actually going out there and walking around the island and drawing a map. It's a map that's being drawn by the physics.
Well, I can't help but notice that the most significant global conflict, one could argue, since the Cold War is the refugee crisis and the corresponding desire to restrict the movements of immigrants. And regardless of one's position on it, I'm not suggesting that one is right and one is wrong per se. I'm not saying that. So what I'm getting at is that if this were a system, somebody's manipulating it.
Yeah, well, it's a system of consciousness. What they're doing is they're manipulating group consciousness. It's a cognitive war, because the refugee.
I mean, because this goes back to the Crusades.
Yep.
And if you go earlier than the Crusades, the ancient Aztecs used to mow down everything around them, build these enormous structures, and require everybody to come to them in order to do sacrifices. So the presence of people in a place of blood is a very ancient motif.
Mm-hmm.
And I even go so far as to think slightly kooky things like, why is it that other than the obvious association with blood, why is it that everywhere you look at this phenomenon you see red, whether it's the Templars or the Nazis and their red banners, or it's the Aztecs, or it's a number of other people I could mention waving around various red banners, signs, and flags today. over the mass migration of people, and very often war made on them, or their annihilation. There's definitely some ritual pageantry involved,
Yes.
if nothing else.
Yes, absolutely. It's a cognitive. I view, taking your Cold War template, I would view this refugee thing as, number one, an engineered crisis, but it's a crisis not simply about, to use mundane terms, clash of civilizations. It's really a crisis of cognition. What they're trying to do is engineer consciousness, and they're doing so by the mass ritual movement of people, as you said. So I think that's partly what's behind it. But it's, as you say, it's nothing new. I mean, look at the Ismaili sect in Islam, the assassins. They basically use this as a technique of social engineering for a very long time. So it's nothing new. It's nothing restricted to Islam. The Aztecs practiced it. The Nazis practiced it. It's a very old technique.
But I guess I'm just saying, I want to be clear that I'm also saying that if it isn't just the mass movement or migration that I'm talking about,
right,
but it's the mass restriction, corralling, and localization of people. So that would mean that people on both sides of the immigration and refugee crisis were doing this.
Yes.
That it is just as important to restrict people from a certain area and restrict other people to that area, and decide where the bunches belong on the map. It would be just as important to have somebody on the right saying, don't allow people to cross this line, as it would to have somebody on the left saying, let them in. You would run both sides.
Yep,
and so
absolutely.
It's as simple as, if you're on the right, you're clearly stopping the tide of ritual movement, but you're probably participating in it.
Yeah, exactly.
Well,
exactly.
All right, let me ask you about the other sort of direction. So you accurately suggested that, or said that what I was suggesting earlier is access to something that goes beyond sort of that's more longitudinal as a method of navigation and spatial awareness, right? Or information technology that is latent to the human being, that could be translated into, necessarily would have to be translated into circuitry in order to do it effectively, efficiently, and consistently. So, but at the beginning of the show, I was also asking about something else, and I want to come back to it, which is, I sort of, if you remember, asked, could one look up at the moon and notice, we've, since the dawn of time, we've been seeing the shadows on the moon, the features of a human face, speculating about there's people up there. The ancients used to say there's people living up there. You can see because they're moving across the face of the moon, and what they meant is the apparent movement of physical features, which they associated with human beings, which we've just talked about, and which one could then extrapolate, perhaps, that if I was an ancient person trying to, and I thought there were mass groups of people moving around on a celestial body, I might want to mirror that by creating mass movements down on the celestial one. I might create a whole occult practice or religion out of moving people around on the earth in a mass way to correspond to the way they move in the heavens. And that's why I ask you if there's sort of a secret tradition. But the other thing that I'm really asking about too is this also a cartographical science, not a science of waves, but a science of observation? Are there actually potentially things, either in constellations or on the moon, that do tell us, aside from the obvious reflection that's there, but are there things that actually would tell the ancients what was on the other side of the world without going there? That they could look up at the sky and either through reflection or through some correspondence that's there by for some other reason, be able to tell.
Yes. The doctrine of correspondences, when you look at ancient astrological systems, there's a doctrine of correspondences. Silver is for the moon, emerald is for Saturn, sapphire is for Saturn. In other words, there's all of this strange lore of correspondences of minerals with the planets and so on and so forth. And on that basis, they do make certain predictions on what they cannot see. Now, if you extrapolate from that, my idea that the ancient texts tell us that these astrological systems were in fact compiled on the basis of observations taken over thousands of years, then that is telling you that there was at one time a high science behind what we now call pseudoscience. So they were able, you know, if you extrapolate from that, then yes, they would be able to make predictions on what they cannot see based on the configuration of things. And we still find physicists doing this. You know, they're saying that there's so-called dark matter simply because of what they're observing in the way that galaxies cluster around each other. All right, they're saying that there has to be something unobserved that's causing this phenomenon to occur. So this still goes on, but let's go back to something very different here. I think that with respect to the idea of a cartographic tradition, might they have had some sort of actual celestial map underlying all of this science? I think that's possible too. In other words, that celestial map would simply be a kind of psychophysics that they were able to correlate astronomical data with aggregate human behavior. And the reason I say that is if you look at ancient astrology was not about making individual predictions for you, Daniel Degree, or me, Joseph Farrell, based on our birthday and our sun sign. Ancient astrology was actually what a modern astrologer would call the mundane horoscope. And a mundane horoscope is simply the prediction of what's going to happen to a nation, or back then to a king, meaning to the king and his kingdom, based on the alignment of planets and so on and so forth. So in other words, that in itself is telling you that ancient astrology was statistically oriented. In other words, it was concerned with aggregate human behavior, aggregate groups of people, rather than an individual. And I think, again, that's a telltale sign that we may be dealing with a lost science of some sort.
Well, I'm also, I can't help but notice that the ancient Babylonian map is quite telling in a couple of features. One is accurate understanding of the presence of or absence of sunlight in these areas, and a direct association with celestial bodies. So here's the description from the Wikipedia. And so here's some quotes. The third island is where the winged bird ends not his flight, meaning it's too far, or it's too big. I think it means it's too big, not too far. I think this is inaccurate. On the fourth island, the light is brighter than that of sunset or stars, meaning it's sort of a lot of summer, a lot of daylight. The fifth island is in complete darkness, a land where one sees nothing. The sun is not visible, so dark all but 1 hour of day. Sixth island, where the horned bull dwells and attacks the newcomer. I can't help but think about the Taurus constellation. And the seventh island is in the east, where the morning dawns. And so I can't help but hear in this the compass points associated with celestial realities, because the sun, they certainly knew and worshipped and treated as a celestial thing more than they did in our particular system now. The way we look at the solar system, we look at the sun almost as an extension of the terrestrial environment, because to us the solar system is small, but to them it's this celestial body. So I look at that stuff and I can't help but think that these guys may have actually been observing something with the naked eye.
Well, pull that map back, pull that Wikipedia thing back up for a minute, if you will. Sure. I want to point something out.
And we all know that obviously around the world are corresponding places from Stonehenge to all over South America that are essentially also solar system maps that correspond very much with this map.
Now, let's look at this. the picture that you see on the screen says it's a reconstruction of Hecataeus's map.
Yeah, this is the Greeks somewhat.
Yeah.
Somewhat
All right.
later, right?
But go scroll back up, please.
Okay.
Right there. That's the picture. But now scroll. That's a reproduction of what has been described. So bring back the descriptions of the islands. All right, and then scroll. All right, now they're telling us that this is a reconstruction of Hecataeus's map. But now look
The
at
lower part is, but the upper part is the Babylonians.
right. But now let's look at the Babylonian description here. What is it actually saying? Third island is where the winged bird ends not his flight, cannot reach. Fourth island is light brighter than that of sunset or stars. The fifth island lay in complete darkness, where one sees nothing, the sun is not visible. The sixth island, and so on. I'm going to suggest that those are not descriptions of places on planet Earth. I'm going to suggest that the Babylonian descriptions there are planets. So in other words, you have here a genuine celestial map with its own, horned bull. You said Taurus. Well, precisely. This is a celestial map, not an earthly one. And this may be again an indicator that they've got some sort of, as you say, predictive science about what these planets actually are like in terms of their environment vis-a-vis the sun and the rest of the planets. That to me is very, very interesting, and to me clearly an astronomical reference. So anyway, bottom line here is I think you're correct. I think that there is some sort of science that lies behind all of this that they're dealing with, and it may be a legacy that they've inherited, and that would be my guess.
Well, that's an interesting take. It still leaves me with the question of whether there's a correspondence.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
And that makes me want to, if we're talking about that, we always assume that if there is a latent ability to navigate built into mammals and reptiles and birds and fish and so on, the other phyla, that it's either it's based on electromagnetic currents, or it's based on gravity, or some other thing like that, rather than that it's observational. And it occurred to me that if this were an important enough ability to build into all these species, it might be important enough to have a backup system. And from technology, when we design technological systems for flight, for instance, for navigation, whether it's a boat or whether it's an airplane, we have backup systems. So my father used to design ground follow-up systems for airliners and military jets. And what he would tell me is, well, there's triple redundancy, son. If one system fails, it fails over to the backup system. If that fails, it fails over to the third backup system. If that fails, you pretty much crash. But the chances of that failing are so infinitesimal. So what if there's a backup system in the species, and the backup system uses observational powers to achieve what non-observational ability would give you? And so that made me think about a couple of things, again, really far-fetched, but one is the Rorschach test. We stare at ink blots, and we discern different things there, and the closest thing to that process is looking up at the clouds and seeing elephants and giraffes, or looking up at the stars and seeing bulls and Orion, the hunter. And I wonder if there is not an innate human or perhaps other animal sense or primate sense that allows us to discern patterns in things that resulted not only in astrology, but also resulted in results in some of the phenomena we see with people doing Rorschach tests. And if we had such a thing, if we had a backup system, we both had some ability to read longitudinal waves, plus we had an observational system all designed to navigate us, then that begs a few questions. Number one, it's a lot like the Force in Star Wars. You have this information source that you can draw on.
Yes.
And you would need a cognitive ability to interpret that wasn't disturbed by all kinds of ideological assumptions and inhibitions and other things that would make you dismiss it or reinterpret it or merely distort the interpretation. And I can't help but also think about the phenomenon of autism, which is it is when somebody takes in far more sensory information than the rest of us. They're like a sieve. And so we're seeing one or two things, maybe three things at a time. The example from a play, The Curious Incident of the Boy and the Dog in the Moonlight, is you're riding along in a train, you look out the train, you see a cow or a bunch of cows and some grass. An autistic person looks out and they see a certain number of cows and how many spots they have and what kind of cow they are and the number of buildings and the relative size of those buildings and 700 other information sources. They're taking in so much information, which is why if you throw them a video game, they get sensory overload, or you put them in an uncomfortable environment where there are too many emotions and things going on, they kind of shut down, and so they don't make a lot of eye contact and so on. And I can't help but think that if we were all lit up and turned on with some of these abilities and could process them in a context that wasn't distorted by the modern condition of civilization, we might have the kind of access to navigate not only our globe, but perhaps celestial bodies that ancient man was expressing when it was creating sites like Stonehenge and some of these pyramids and these ancient sites. And so that brings me to the actual question, one last thought, which is, if one designed such a system into man and designed a backup system or two, and for what purpose would this system be designed into us? Would it be designed into us merely to navigate the globe, or would it be designed into us because man inherently was designed to navigate things beyond the globe, or even beyond our known physical space and physics?
Yes, short answer to all the above, yes. I think that's the way mankind was designed. He's designed, so to speak, to have communion with God, to participate in divine things. All right. So in other words, putting this into the framework of our topological metaphor, you raised a very good question. Why did the ancients look up at the stars and see certain things? And if you look at what they're doing, they're creating a symbolic language out of physical things by a process of analogy. And that in itself is, I think, the mechanism by which they did this. Well, that looks like this, that looks like that, so on and so forth. They were seeing patterns in things based on this process of analogy. They're creating symbols, whole symbolic languages out of this process with the Egyptian hieroglyphs and so on and so forth. What we have lost in the West particularly is the ability to see and use symbolic languages. Now, that said, I do agree that I think the elites use symbolism as their main means of communication and their main means of sending messages. So in other words, they understand that mankind is still deeply wired into that whole way of thinking. It's just that most of us have forgotten it, or it's been educated out of us. And the reason I say that is, you look at our educational system, we've said this before, it's all fragmented into so-called disciplines, and you never learn to make any connections between any of them. And that's really what true learning, and in the Platonic sense, what true genius was all about. It was the ability to make, not only make connections, but make connections that were apt, that resonated, that had truth to them. All right. So I think if you go back to this idea that the constellations, Orion's Hunter, the Hunter's Belt and all of that, if you look at the ancient system of constellations, this is coming from somewhere. It's coming from a little understood process that I think we're only just beginning to understand again. But do I think we're hardwired with that system? Yes, absolutely I do. Humans learn analogically. So the real trick is figuring out what makes analogies work. And again, it's the transference of information, of a set of information, from one context to another, that allows us to do this, to learn unknown things. I think it's hardwired into the system. I think it's hardwired into the cosmos, as it were. And on that basis, you can make predictions. The trouble is when you look at esoteric systems, the analogies are inept. In other words, they don't make much sense to us. There's not the sense that they are deeply intuitive. They appear ad hoc. They appear random. That to me indicates that either we've forgotten something, that we're not understanding something, or that they are indeed ad hoc and random. But they're telling us a profound clue about the nature of reality nonetheless, and we've just got to figure out a way to make them apt again. I hope that's making sense.
It does make sense, but I still want to dig in further because I'm not fully satisfied in a couple of areas. And one is that I can't help but go back to this question of a physical correlation between the moon's geographic features and the Earth's geographic features. And there's a new science. We know that the moon is a mirror for the sun. But what I'm really asking you is if the moon is a mirror for the Earth and the sun is the light source. And the reason I bring this up is I'm going to read a bit of an article from the Christian Science Monitor, and it says, astronomers have managed to detect the telltale fingerprints of organic life on Earth using a new technique that examines sunlight reflected onto the moon by our planet. The so-called Earthshine observations may pave the way for a similar tool to help spot signs of alien life in the universe. To say. So what they're saying is we can look up the moon with light shining on it and tell where living things are on the Earth and where the signs of life are. And we may be able to look at other celestial bodies and use them as mirrors to detect the signs of alien life. And so to me, that's fascinating for a couple of reasons, because we've talked about before, I mean, in your book about cosmic war, and of course, starting with the Giza Death Star, you've talked about the notion of an ancient cosmic war that spanned the solar system perhaps, and possibly created some of the cataclysms that resulted in things like the moon breaking off, right? And I can't help but wonder, the second part of sort of my point and question, you know, if I'm sitting there thinking through it, is there some correlation? Has anybody really taken the moon and the Earth and done a line-to-line geometric study to see if there are correspondences between the geographic features of one and the other that are sort of hard-coded in, that the ancients could look up and observe and go, based on the light shining on the moon at this angle, not just as a reflective surface, not just as a mirror, but we believe this is on the Earth. Or could they have used it as a mirror? Could the ancient moon have had more reflective qualities, or the atmosphere have provided? Could the atmosphere have provided the ability to more clearly see features on the Earth reflected? Could the ancient people have had access, in other words, to this Earthshine phenomenon and used it to simply, the way you'd use a mirror to see around the corner, simply use it to map the Earth? So that's really what I'm asking you.
Well,
but there's this one second part. I want to throw this at you, and then I'll shut up. Which is, it seems to me that if there's this ancient ability to navigate by this other method of using longitudinal waves, that there would have to be now, and for possibly hundreds of years in a millennia, there would have to be a hermetic quest to fix the math. And the reason why is because the reason why the math would be broken, you know that if we do a bunch of calculations for the room, but some other guy's changing the room while you're doing the calculations, your predictions are going to be off. You're going to fly into the walls.
Bingo.
So all you would have to do to massively screw up the math would be, one, to sink a continent, something like Atlantis or Mu, and you could do that purposefully if you wanted to conceal the knowledge. If you wanted to eliminate this ability from the human consciousness, you would mess up natural patterns and drive antelope off cliffs and stuff like that. But you could sink a body, a big enough landmass that it would mess up this math for everybody for centuries. But the other thing you could do would be to break off a chunk of the planet. And send that out into space, which would really kick over your sandcastle. It would jack up your equations, right?
Yeah.
So this
or you could blow up a planet.
You could blow chunks off of it. Yeah. So this is what I'm trying to get to, Dr. Farrell. I'm trying to ask you if A, there's a mirror that may have been more useful because of atmospheric differences or differences to the surface then. B, you wouldn't even need a mirror because somehow it's a chunk of the Earth where there's a direct geometric correspondence between Earth and lunar features. And third, would the breaking off of the moon or the sinking of continents jack up some kind of math that's been around for a long time? And the information science quest we're talking about with the Russians and DARPA is to reacquire the math needed to create this navigational system that we're going to do interstellar travel.
Yes. Yes to all of the above. Yes to all the above. Now, do I know of anybody who's attempted to make correlations between features on the moon and the Earth? Answer, no. To my knowledge, no one has tried to do that kind of exact correspondence research. All right,
Dr. Farrell, I just want to say that's so strange because we've done it with the continents where they've fallen apart and glued them back together. Why wouldn't anybody think to reintegrate the moon and draw the correspondent?
Precisely, because what is the moon? Well, we all know tides. You know, the biggest gravitational effect on planet Earth besides the sun is the moon. So, you know, the fact that it's up there doing what it does is going to have an effect on the geophysics of the Earth. Absolutely. It's going to have an effect on the appearance of mountain ranges here and not there, and so on and so forth, depending on where the moon is, what it's doing, the composition of the Earth, and so on. But to my knowledge, no one has done this. But is there a correspondence? Absolutely. You know, absolutely there is. We've known about it all along. Now, if anybody is doing it, I suspect that it's being done very, very quietly because, as you say, it's going to jack up the mathematics. Let's go back to what I said in Giza Death Star Destroyed. You had the cosmic war. Marduk blows up Tiamat, you know, the planet that's now the asteroid belt. And then at the end of this war, what does the Enuma Elish say Marduk did? The first thing it says is Marduk measured the structure of the deep, of the abyss, in other words, of space. Well, why does Marduk have to do that? Well, because you've just blown up a planet. You've thrown a huge celestial monkey wrench into the celestial mechanics of the solar system, and therefore your whole system of astrological prediction and so on and so forth. So yeah, would you sink a continent to throw everybody off? Would you blow up a planet and would that throw everybody off? Yeah, absolutely. No one, Daniel, to my knowledge, has done what you're suggesting, made exact correspondences between, let's say, the mare on the moon and the Earth, the mountain ranges on the moon and the Earth, and the physical features on it. And I suspect that it has been done secretly, but let me throw in another curveball. If you look at the moon, as we both know, the far side of the moon, the so-called dark side, which it really isn't dark, it's in sunlight all the time. But the far side of the moon is, as you know, much, much more cratered than the near side. The near side of the moon has a surface density of very heavy metals, titanium and so on and so forth. And it has these smooth, glassy seas. I suspect that that too is a consequence of that cosmic war. I think, you know, the thing was literally bombarded to death. So yeah, all of this enters into it. And I do think that there is a correspondent science to this simply by the phenomenon of tides. But the problem is no one's making what you're suggesting, the exact correspondences. I don't know of anything in the public literature that is trying to do that.
That's just so really strange to me. I mean, as a kid, I sat there with a colored pencil and tried to reconnect the continents into one giant landmass because somebody told me that that some people think that's what they once were. And I'm like, well, let's see if the puzzle pieces. Every kid grows up to it with little puzzles, right? Even you know, in a 4-year-old, they give you a puzzle made out of 8 or 10 parts. I mean, there's only 7 continents. Let's glue them back together. It would strike me that if the moon really was what everybody says it is, that it's a chunk blown off the Earth, why, you know, by a meteorite or whatever, why can't we stick it back on again and see where it would fit? And would the geographic features not then change our conception of our own world map, but also give us some sense. If you can predict the layouts of parts of 3/4 of a room, if you can predict the general features of the room, then you can extrapolate what the first, if you got the first 3/4, you can extrapolate what the other quarter is.
Right. But the problem here is the moon being a chunk of the Earth. It's not a theory I subscribe to, but you still wouldn't need to subscribe to that theory to do what you're saying, because the mere fact that it is exerting a gravitational tidal effect on the Earth means that it is going to influence the geology, geography, and topography of the Earth over time. That's just very clear. So even without that idea, you still have the possibility that these correspondences exist, and to my knowledge, again, no one is doing them. The problem with the moon is, you know, as Isaac Newton said, it's the only thing that gives me a headache, because if it were blown off the Earth, it wouldn't be in the orbit that it is doing what it does. It's in a nearly circular orbit. It is precisely positioned so that during eclipses, it blots out the body of the sun, leaving only the corona. If it were captured by the Earth, then it would be in a much more elliptical orbit, and so on and so forth. So, you know, I'm with the Soviets here. Somebody parked it there, you know?
But I still can't help but think, I mean, there's multiple options here, regardless of how the moon came about, as you say. There could be a correspondence by extrapolation if it had been part of the Earth. There could be correspondence by seismic activity. That you could predict, hey, if I do this, there's an earthquake. If at this time there's an earthquake, it produces this. I could use that to extrapolate topological features of the Earth by the effects of the moon on other parts of the Earth. So extrapolation, seismic relationships, and then also the mirror effect. I mean, if there was water on the ancient surface of the moon and that increased its reflectiveness and ability to take advantage of something that the scientists are now calling earthshine, in a way that we can't, or if the cleaner atmosphere allowed it. I know that's really far-fetched, but if you go back far enough, it would strike me that whether it's a mirror or by geographic extrapolation or by seismic relationships, you'd be able to use it to map a good chunk of the planet. And that there may actually be some attempt to obscure that ability, some attempt to hide that particular science. And that may be part of the reason why so much of something as silly as the camera photos from parts of the moon, the actual mapping of the moon, some of it is classified.
Yeah, well, I think it's not only that, but you know, we know that the ancients were thinking in terms of correspondences between the Earth and the moon simply because they coupled the moon to a woman's menstrual cycle. So in other words, they were very attuned to this. So you know, it doesn't take much to see that they would go further in that respect. And I do think that, again, you're right. There has to be a detailed set of correspondences. I suspect strongly, and I have suspected strongly, Daniel, that with certain types of machines that humanity has built, like HARP, you mentioned earlier, I think CERN is definitely a planetary machine, that one of the things they're doing are what we've called in the vid chats data correlation experiments. Do we see an increase of certain types of activity when CERN is turned on with human behavior, with market behavior, with solar activity? And by the same token, are we thumping the moon in some way that it's going to have some sort of bounce back effect on the Earth? So yeah, there's all sorts of correspondences here that need to be investigated. And that's going to give us a clue to some profound physics. And again, because of that, I think that they're going to keep it very, very secret. So when I say that I don't know of any public correspondence of the detailed nature that you're suggesting, that doesn't mean I don't think it's not going on. I just think that they're going to be very, very quiet about it.
Well, it's if you could use the Earth as a mirror to detect life signs on the Earth, and you could turn it to celestial bodies, that would be
absolutely.
You wouldn't want to have just fall into everybody's hands and give them full access to the cameras and the devices.
Exactly.
For calculating and measuring this, but you still would have the math issues that you have, because if our relationship to the Earth has shifted, that could affect things.
Yep.
I mean, if our relationship to the moon has shifted. And You didn't fully flesh out this, and it may be because you've done so enough that your listeners are fully attuned to it. But you didn't fully flesh out this notion of a hermetic quest to fix the math, and I'm still curious about that. I think I've lost you. We're sort of at the end of the show anyway, so.